The moment Monroe Cooper's eyes landed on the small gold locket resting against the hollow of the stranger's throat, his heart stopped as completely as if someone had pressed a hand flat against his chest and held it there. The year was 1878, and the town of Harlan Creek, Texas, had seen its share of dust-coated travelers rolling through on the stage line that connected the smaller settlements to the larger rail depot at Fort Worth. Monroe had lived in Harlan Creek long enough to know every face that belonged there and every face that didn't, and the woman sitting alone at the far end of the lunch counter at Della's eating house most certainly did not belong. She was perhaps 24 or 25, with dark auburn hair pulled into a loose knot at the base of her neck, a few strands escaping to frame a face that was striking more for its expression than its features, though the features were fine enough. She looked tired in the way that people look tired when the weariness was not just in the body but had settled deep into the bones, the kind of exhaustion that came from carrying something heavy for a very long time. Monroe might have simply taken note of her and moved on to his plate of beans and cornbread had it not been for the locket. It was small and oval-shaped, the gold worn just slightly at the edges, and it hung from a delicate chain that caught the afternoon light coming through Della's front window. He had last seen that locket 8 years ago, pressed into a pair of hands that were about to be closed forever over it, and the sight of it now, gleaming against the throat of a woman he had never met, sent something wild and painful and confused shooting straight through the center of him. He was 30 years old, Monroe Cooper. Tall, lean in the way that men who worked cattle and rode long miles tended to become lean, with dark eyes set beneath a brow that had spent most of its life squinting against sun and weather. He had a jaw that needed shaving and hands that were scarred from rope burns and one badly healed fence wire cut along his left palm, and he was not by nature a man who did impulsive things. He thought before he spoke, and he moved deliberately, and the people who knew him in Harlan Creek respected him for that steadiness. But he was staring now, and the woman at the end of the counter had noticed. She turned her head and met his eyes without flinching, and there was something in her gaze that was both guarded and direct, like someone who had learned to face things head-on because looking away had never helped. She did not smile. She simply looked at him, and then she looked down at her coffee cup, which told him she was not inviting conversation but also that she was not entirely opposed to it. Monroe set his hat on the empty stool beside him and picked up his coffee. He drank it slowly, trying to collect his thoughts into something that made sense, because what he was feeling right now made very little sense at all. The locket could not be the same one. There were plenty of gold lockets in the world, and Texas alone probably had 100 of them hanging from 100 different necks on any given afternoon. He was being foolish. He was letting grief and memory do what grief and memory always did when a man let his guard down for half a second, which was reach up out of whatever dark place he had buried them and remind him they were still very much alive. He stood up from his stool, and he told himself he was going to pay Della for his meal and walk back out to the livery where his horse was drinking, and ride the 7 miles back to the Callaway Ranch, where he had been working for the last 3 years, and that would be the end of it. What he actually did was pick up his hat and coffee and walk to the empty stool 2 down from the woman and sit. She looked at him again with those careful eyes. "I apologize for staring," Monroe said. "I know it was rude and I am not going to pretend it wasn't." She studied him for a moment. "People stare at strangers out here. I have noticed that." Her voice had a slight quality to it that he could not immediately identify, a measured cadence that suggested she had grown up somewhere with a different rhythm than Texas. Not Southern, not exactly Northern either. Missouri, maybe, or Kansas. Somewhere in that broad middle belt of the country where the accent sat between things. "They do," Monroe agreed. "But I had a reason beyond curiosity, and I would like to explain it if you are willing to hear it, because I don't want you to think I am the kind of man who bothers women who are clearly sitting alone on purpose." Something shifted in her expression, a very small softening. "All right," she said. "I am willing to hear it." Monroe set his cup down and turned on his stool to face her more directly. "That locket you are wearing," he said. "I believe I have seen it before. I know how that sounds. But I wanted to ask you about it." Her hand went to it immediately and instinctively, the way people touch things that mattered to them when someone pointed at those things. Her fingers wrapped around it, and she looked at him with something sharpened in her expression now, not quite alarm, but close. "Where would you have seen it?" she asked. "My name is Monroe Cooper," he said. "I am a ranch hand at the Callaway spread 7 miles east. I have been in this county 3 years, but I grew up in Abilene. Before I came here, I spent some years working the cattle drives north, and before that I was—" He paused, because the before that was the part that still had teeth. "I was living in a small town called Greer's Mill, south of Abilene, a long time ago, 8 years ago." She was watching him with full attention now, the coffee forgotten. "What is your name?" he asked. "Lydia," she said. "Lydia Keene." "Miss Keene," Monroe said, and then stopped. He looked at the locket again. "That locket was given to a woman named Clara Holt in Greer's Mill in 1870. I gave it to her. It was my mother's, and I gave it to Clara because she was—" He stopped again, and something in him pressed down on what was rising. "Because she meant a great deal to me. Clara passed away in the spring of 1870, a fever. It was very sudden. And I thought the locket went with her. I thought it was buried with her. And here you are wearing it 8 years later, in a town she never heard of, and I don't know what to make of that, Miss Keene, except that I could not walk out that door without asking." The silence that followed his words had a particular texture to it. Lydia Keene's fingers were still curled around the locket, and her expression had gone through several things very quickly and had arrived at something that Monroe could only describe as complicated. "Clara Holt," she said softly. "Clara was my cousin." Monroe sat very still. "She was my mother's sister's daughter," Lydia continued, and her voice was quieter now, more careful. "We grew up near each other. She was 2 years older than me. When she died, her mother, my Aunt Pearl, kept a few of her things. Aunt Pearl passed 3 years ago, and the locket came to me." She looked down at it, still holding it between her fingers. "I have worn it every day since. I never knew where it came from. I never knew anyone had given it to her." Monroe was quiet for a long moment. The sounds of Della's eating house went on around them. The clink of dishes, the murmur of 2 ranchers talking near the door, the distant crack of a wagon wheel on the dry street outside, and none of it seemed to quite reach the small space he and Lydia Keene were occupying at the end of that counter. "She never told you?" he asked. "She never told anyone about you," Lydia said. "Or if she did, it didn't reach me." She looked up at him. "How long were you together?" "Almost 2 years," Monroe said. "We were going to be married. The fever took her in March, and by April I had left Greer's Mill. I could not stay." Lydia nodded slowly, as if she understood that particular kind of leaving. "I am sorry," she said, "about Clara, and about the shock of seeing this. I can only imagine what it must have been like to look across a room and see it." "It stopped my heart a little," Monroe admitted, and then felt almost startled that he had said it out loud, because he was not generally a man who said things like that. But something about Lydia Keene made him feel like plain speaking was both safe and required. "Are you going to ask me to give it back?" she asked, and there was no accusation in the question, only a kind of honest directness. "No," Monroe said immediately. "No, it belongs with her family. It always should have. I am glad it found its way to you." Lydia looked at him for another long moment, and then she did something that surprised him. She smiled. It was a small smile, but it was real, and it changed her face considerably, bringing warmth into features that had been composed and contained. "Can I ask what brings you to Harlan Creek?" Monroe said. The smile faded, not entirely, but enough that he noticed. "I am looking for a position," she said. "I was teaching school in a town called Millhaven, about 40 miles north of here. The school board there decided that married women made better teachers than unmarried ones, and since I am unmarried, they replaced me with the wife of one of the board members." She said it flatly, without excessive emotion, but Monroe could hear the edge underneath. I heard from someone on the stage that Harlan Creek has been trying to find a schoolteacher for the better part of a year. So here I am." Monroe thought about this. He thought about the fact that Harlan Creek did indeed need a teacher rather desperately, because the Reverend's wife had been holding school 3 days a week in the back of the church, but she was not a trained teacher, and the children were suffering for it. He thought about the fact that Lydia Keene had clearly been traveling for some time, and that the tiredness in her face suggested she had not slept well in a while. He thought about the locket. "The man you want to talk to is Judge Harlan," Monroe said. "He runs most of what happens in this town. His office is on the main street, the white building with the green shutters. He's the one who would approve the hire." "Thank you," Lydia said. She picked up her coffee cup again. "Mr. Cooper, can I ask you something?" "Monroe," he said, "please." "Monroe," she said, and something about the way she said his name carefully, like she was getting the weight of it right, made him feel it more than he expected to. "Did you love her very much, Clara?" It was a direct question. It could have been an intrusive one, but it wasn't, because she was Clara's family and she had a right to ask it, and because there was genuine feeling behind it. "I did," Monroe said. "She was the first person I loved that way. I was 22 and she was 20, and I thought we had all the time in the world." He looked at his coffee. "You learn, losing someone that young, that time is not a thing you can count on." "No," Lydia agreed softly. "It is not." They sat quietly together for a moment that felt strangely comfortable for two people who had met 20 minutes ago. Monroe paid for his meal and hers, which caused her to look at him with a lifted eyebrow, and he said simply that it was the least he could do given that he had startled her out of a peaceful lunch, and she accepted this with the same quiet directness that was becoming something he recognized as characteristic of her. He walked her to Judge Harlan's office. He had not planned to do that either, but they had walked out of Della's at the same time, and the judge's office was in the direction of the livery anyway, and it seemed unkind to leave her to navigate the town alone when he had caused her so much surprise already. Judge Harlan was a broad, white-haired man of 60 or so who had been in Harlan Creek since before it had its current name, and he ran things with a combination of firm pragmatism and occasional genuine fairness that made him more tolerable than a lot of men in his position. He looked up from his desk when Monroe came in with Lydia Keene at his side, and his eyebrows rose in a way that Monroe chose to ignore. "Judge," Monroe said, "this is Miss Lydia Keene. She's a trained schoolteacher, recently come from Millhaven. She's looking for a position." Judge Harlan stood up because he was old-fashioned about that sort of thing at least and extended a hand to Lydia. "Miss Keene, you trained where?" "The Leavenworth Female Seminary in Kansas," Lydia said, and her voice had taken on a quality Monroe had not yet heard, a professional clarity that told him she had done this before and knew how to do it. "I taught for 3 years in Millhaven. I have letters of recommendation from the school superintendent there and from the parents of several of my students." She produced a small folded bundle of letters from her coat pocket and set them on the desk. The judge read through them with more attention than Monroe expected, and the office was quiet except for the distant sounds of the street outside, a horse going by, someone calling out to someone else, the ordinary sounds of a working afternoon in a small Texas town. When he was done, Judge Harlan set the letters down and looked at Lydia with a measuring expression. "You're not married," he said. Monroe saw Lydia's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "I am not," she said. "I would point out that the ability to teach arithmetic and reading has very little to do with one's marital status." The judge studied her. Then he let out a short sound that was not quite a laugh. "Fair point," he said. "I need someone who can manage 30 children in a one-room schoolhouse, Miss Keene. We've got everything from 6-year-olds to 15-year-olds in there, farm children mostly, and some of them haven't been inside a school building in 2 or 3 years. It takes patience and it takes authority. Do you have both?" "I have been told I have more of the latter than is always comfortable," Lydia said. This time the judge did laugh. "All right, Miss Keene. I'll offer you the position on a trial period of 6 weeks. Salary is $12 a month. We have a room you can use above the general store, which Hattie Bosworth runs. It's small, but it's clean. $12 a month was not generous, Monroe knew. It was, in fact, somewhat below what a male teacher in the same position might have received, and the injustice of that was something he felt quietly and clearly, though the judge did not seem troubled by it. But he also knew it was better than nothing, and that Lydia Keene knew it too, because she accepted without flinching and thanked the judge with a steady handshake. They walked out into the afternoon light, and Lydia let out a breath that was longer and more relieved than she probably intended him to hear. "Congratulations," Monroe said. She looked at him sideways. "Thank you for bringing me here. You didn't have to do that." "No," he agreed. "I wanted to." She looked at him for a moment with those careful brown eyes, and then she smiled that small, real smile again. "I think today has been the strangest afternoon I have had in a very long time," she said. "A man recognized my locket, and it turned out he loved my dead cousin, and now I have a job." Monroe laughed. It came out of him more easily than laughing usually did. "That is quite a summary." "I am a schoolteacher," she said. "We are trained to be concise." He left her at the door of the general store, where Hattie Bosworth, a wide, energetic woman of about 50, took one look at Lydia and immediately began talking about the room upstairs and what she would need, and wasn't it wonderful that they finally had a real teacher, and had she eaten because there was soup. Monroe stood in the doorway for just a moment, watching Lydia Keene get absorbed into Harlan Creek, and he felt something that he could not entirely name settle in his chest, something that was part the old grief of Clara and part something new and tentative and careful, and he was not at all sure what to do with it. He rode back to the Calloway Ranch in the long slanted light of early evening, and he was quieter than usual at supper, and the other ranch hands, who knew him well enough to know that his quiet moods were his own business, left him alone with it. He thought about Clara. He always thought about Clara when he let himself, which was not often, because the shape of that loss was still present even 8 years later, worn smooth by time but never entirely gone. He remembered her dark eyes and the way she laughed, and the afternoon he had put the locket around her neck, and she had looked up at him with something that was part delight and part the weight of knowing how much he meant it. He had not loved lightly, and he had not recovered quickly, and for a long time after he left Greer's mill he had simply worked, one ranch and then another, one cattle drive and then the next, filling time with physical labor, because it was the only thing that consistently got between him and his own grief. And now Clara's cousin was in Harlan Creek with that locket around her neck, and Monroe Cooper was going to have to figure out what that meant. He rode into town 3 days later on a Saturday, which was not unusual because most of the Calloway hands came in on Saturdays, and he told himself that he was coming for supplies and a drink at the Silver Rail Saloon and nothing else. He saw Lydia Keene through the window of the general store, talking to Hattie Bosworth over a length of calico fabric, and she looked less tired than she had 3 days ago. There was color in her face, and she was gesturing at something with what appeared to be genuine animation, and Hattie was nodding and laughing, and Monroe stood on the boardwalk for a moment before pushing on to do his errands. He found her eventually, as he supposed he had known he would, sitting on the steps of the schoolhouse at the end of the main street. The schoolhouse was a plain wooden building that had been built 6 years ago and had been used intermittently since, and it clearly needed some attention. Lydia was sitting on the top step with a notebook open across her knees and was writing with the focused intensity of someone making lists. "Miss Keene," Monroe said, tipping his hat. She looked up. "Monroe," there was that careful weight to it again. "Come to look at the school. Come to see how you are settling in," he said, which was true. "Reasonably well," she said. "Hattie is kind. The room is small, but it has a good window. I have been trying to understand what supplies the school has and what it needs, and the answer is that it has very little and needs a great deal." She looked down at her list with an expression that suggested this was not entirely unexpected but was still frustrating. The primers are from 1862 and some of them are missing pages. There is one slate board and enough chalk for approximately 2 weeks. There are no maps. Monroe sat down on the step below her, which put him at an angle where he could see her face without having to look up at it. "I could talk to the judge about the supply situation," he said. "He has funds for the school set aside. He just never has anyone to tell him what's actually needed." "That would be helpful," Lydia said, "though I intend to do that myself. I don't want the judge to think I need someone to speak for me." "No," Monroe agreed. "I can see you don't." She gave him a look that was part amused and part assessing. "You have come into town to check on me," she said, not unkindly. "Yes," Monroe said simply. "Why?" He thought about it honestly, because she asked the question honestly and she deserved an honest answer. "Because I brought you into this town in some sense," he said. "Because you are Clara's family. And because I found myself wondering how you were doing." She was quiet for a moment, turning her pencil over in her fingers. "Clara talked about me sometimes, do you think?" she asked. "Did she mention family?" "She did," Monroe said and tried to remember. "She talked about her mother and her aunt. I don't remember if she mentioned you specifically by name. She was. Clara kept some things private. She was not secretive exactly, but she had certain rooms in herself that she kept the doors closed on. She was like that even as a child," Lydia said, and there was affection and sadness mixed together in her voice. "She would appear somewhere with something already decided and fully formed, and you'd realize she'd been thinking about it privately for months. She never let anyone see the process. She touched the locket at her throat briefly. I think she would have liked you. What I know of you so far, anyway." "What do you know of me so far?" Monroe asked, genuinely curious. Lydia considered. "You are deliberate. You do not speak unless you mean to. You gave my cousin something that belonged to your mother, which means you are capable of very serious feeling. You walked a stranger to the judge's office and paid for her lunch and didn't make it into anything awkward, which means you have good manners and some decency." She paused. "And you come into town on your day off to sit on the schoolhouse steps and ask how someone is doing, which means you are probably not very good at leaving things alone once they matter to you." Monroe looked at her. "That is a lot to know about someone from one afternoon and one Saturday." "I told you," she said, "teachers are trained to be observant." He laughed again, that same easier-than-usual laugh. "What about you, Miss Keene? What should I know about you?" She seemed to think about this seriously. "I am 25 years old," she said. "I grew up in Abilene, Kansas, which is probably farther east than the Abilene you know." "I know the one in Kansas," Monroe said. "Good. My father was a dry goods merchant who died when I was 14 of a weak heart, and my mother has been living with her brother's family in St. Louis since I was 18. I went to the seminary because I needed to be able to support myself, and teaching was one of the few things a woman could do with any reliability. I like teaching genuinely, not just as a necessity, which I think makes a difference." She looked at him directly. "I have not been in love, if that is something you are curious about, which you might be given the circumstances." Monroe held her gaze. "I was curious," he admitted. "I apologize if that's presumptuous." "It's not presumptuous," she said. "It's natural. You were in love with someone connected to me. Of course you wonder about the shape of my life." She looked out at the street, where a pair of horses were tied to the rail in front of the silver rail, and 2 men were having what appeared to be a mild argument about the best way to load a wagon. "There was a man in Millhaven, a teacher himself at the boys' academy 2 towns over. We corresponded for a year and he came to call 3 or 4 times, but it did not become anything real. He wanted someone more." She paused, searching for the right word. "Decorative," she said finally. "He wanted someone who would sit nicely and not disagree with him about things. I could not manage that." "No," Monroe said. "I don't imagine you could." She looked back at him and the smile came again, and this time it lasted a little longer. He walked with her through the town as the afternoon went on, not because they had planned it, but because they were both going the same direction and neither of them suggested stopping. She asked him about the ranch, and he told her about the cattle operation, the size of the Callaway herd and the rhythm of the work, and what the land looked like out east of town. She listened with genuine interest and asked good questions, the kind that showed she was actually thinking about what he was telling her and not just being polite. He told her about the drives he had done before settling at Callaway's, the long months moving cattle north to Dodge City or Abilene, the particular quality of exhaustion and freedom that came with that kind of work, the way the sky looked over the plains at night with no towns and no buildings for 50 miles in any direction, just stars from horizon to horizon. "That sounds lonely," she said. "It was," he said. "I didn't mind it for a long time. After Clara, I think lonely felt safe." He was quiet a moment. "That probably sounds strange." "It doesn't," Lydia said. "If loving someone costs you that much when you lose them, keeping your distance from feeling anything too big makes complete sense. It's not cowardly, it's just," she looked for the word, "protective of yourself." "Yes," he said, "exactly that." She was looking at him steadily, and he was looking at her, and the town moved around them in the late Saturday afternoon, horses and wagons and people calling to each other, and the light was that long golden color that Texas did in summer evenings, pouring down the main street like warm water. "I hope you don't intend to stay lonely forever," Lydia said, and then looked away, and he thought he saw color come into her face that was not entirely from the sun. "I am beginning to think I don't," Monroe said. He rode back to the Callaway ranch that evening with the feeling that something had shifted in the world, some small tectonic thing that hadn't made any noise but had moved nonetheless. The following weeks unfolded with the particular quality of late summer in Texas, dry and very hot, the sky a bleached-out blue during the days, and then blazing with stars at night. Monroe worked the ranch through the week and rode into town on Saturdays, and he and Lydia Keene fell into a habit that neither of them spoke about directly, but that both of them kept to with care. She would be somewhere in the town on Saturday afternoons, either at the school or at Hattie's store or occasionally at Della's for her lunch, and he would find her, and they would spend an hour or two or sometimes 3 in each other's company. They talked constantly and easily and about everything. They talked about books, because Lydia read widely and Monroe had developed a habit of reading during the long, quiet evenings on cattle drives and at the ranch, and they discovered they had strong and sometimes opposite opinions about things, which they argued about pleasantly and at length. They talked about the town, about the people Lydia was coming to know, the families of her students, and the particular dynamics of a small settlement where everyone's business was more or less public. She talked about the children with a warmth and specificity that told him she genuinely saw them as individuals and not just as pupils, talking about one boy's genius for numbers and another girl's frustration at being kept home to help with the harvest when she wanted to be in school. The injustice of that last thing she felt strongly. "The boys are kept home sometimes too," she said one afternoon, sitting across from Monroe at Della's with her hands wrapped around her coffee cup. "But the girls more often, and for longer. The assumption is that a girl's education matters less because her future is already decided. She'll keep a house and raise children and the arithmetic she needs for that she could learn by watching her mother." She shook her head. "But if you teach a girl to read and cipher properly, she can do anything a man can do when it comes to thinking. She can run a business or manage accounts or write letters that mean something. The ability to think is not a gendered ability." "You sound like you have made this argument before," Monroe observed. "Many times," Lydia said. "Usually to men who nod politely and then continue doing exactly as they were doing." "I'm not nodding politely," Monroe said. "I'm agreeing with you." She looked at him across the table. "You are, aren't you?" she said, and sounded mildly surprised. "My mother was a woman who could have run a cattle operation if anyone had let her," Monroe said. "She managed the finances of everything my father ever owned, and he knew it and was grateful for it even if he'd have swallowed his tongue before saying so in public. I grew up watching her think. It left an impression." Something in Lydia's expression softened in the particular way that it did when she was genuinely moved by something but didn't want to make a production of it. "She sounds wonderful," she said. "She was," Monroe said. "She passed about 10 years ago. Heart, same as your father. I sometimes think the hardest thing about losing people when you're young is that you carry everything alone after that." "Yes," Lydia said, very quietly. "Yes, that is exactly it." They sat with that for a moment, two people who had both lost parents too young and had both been making their way alone for a long time, and the understanding between them was warm and private and very real. Monroe helped her with the school. This started practically when he came by one Saturday in early September and found her trying to wrestle a stuck window open by herself, the wood swollen with the last of the summer heat, and he fixed it in 10 minutes, and then looked at the rest of the building, and spent the next 2 hours making a list of what needed repair. He came back the following Monday evening after his work at the ranch was done and fixed 3 loose floorboards, and rehung the door so it sat properly in its frame. She brought him coffee, and they sat on the schoolhouse steps afterward in the early dark, and the sky above Harlan Creek was enormous and full of stars, and Monroe was aware with increasing clarity that he was in trouble in the most specific and particular way, which was that he was falling in love with Lydia Keene, and he didn't know what to do about it. The thing that complicated it, beyond the ordinary complications of falling in love with someone who was not yet looking at you that way, was Clara. It felt like something he needed to think about carefully and honestly, the question of whether what he felt for Lydia was real and new or whether it was tangled up in grief and in the shock of the locket, and in the fact that she was connected to someone he had lost. He turned it over in his mind for days, sitting with it the way he sat with difficult things, quietly and without rushing to a conclusion. What he arrived at, in the honest quiet of a Tuesday night when the other ranch hands were asleep, and he was sitting on the bunkhouse porch watching the dark, was this. He loved Clara still, and probably always would, in the way that you loved the first person who opened that room in you and showed you what it looked like. That love was complete and real, and it was also finished, sealed off by her death into something permanent and past. What he felt for Lydia was different in every dimension. It was present and alive and growing, and it had nothing to do with Clara except that Clara's locket had brought them together, and maybe that was the strangest and most beautiful thing about it. He did not rush it. He was 30 years old, and he had learned that the things worth having were worth approaching carefully, and Lydia Keene was worth every careful thing he had in him. School started in the second week of September, and Lydia threw herself into it with an energy that Monroe found genuinely impressive. She had managed, through a combination of the judge's budget and a donation drive she organized with Hattie Bosworth's help, to procure new primers, 4 slate boards, a set of arithmetic cards, and a rolled map of the United States that she hung above the blackboard with clear satisfaction. The parents of her students were cautiously interested in her in the early weeks, and she won them over steadily and practically, because she was direct with them about their children's progress and genuinely patient with the slower learners, and openly enthusiastic about the gifted ones. Monroe heard about her from 3 different directions. Hattie talked about her when he came for supplies. One of the Calloway Ranch's neighboring landowners, a man named Pete Grogan, whose 2 children attended Lydia's school, said at a supply run that the new teacher was the sharpest thing to come to Harlan Creek in years. Judge Harlan stopped Monroe on the street one Saturday in late September and said, "That teacher you brought me is a real one. I'm extending her appointment past the trial period." "She's not something I brought you," Monroe said mildly. "She walked in on her own." The judge smiled. "You brought her to my office. She would have found it herself. Probably faster," the judge agreed. "You sweet on her, Monroe." Monroe put on his hat. "Good afternoon, Judge." The judge laughed and went back inside. He was, of course. He was very sweet on her, to use the judge's antiquated phrasing, and it was beginning to show in ways he could not entirely control, which was unfamiliar territory for a man as naturally contained as Monroe Cooper. He brought her things. Small, useful things, because he was not a man for grand gestures, and she was not a woman who would have been comfortable receiving them. A good quality lead pencil from the stationery shop in Fort Worth that he picked up during a supply run to the rail depot. A small book of poetry by Emily Dickinson that he had seen in the window of the dry goods store in the next town and had known immediately she would want. A piece of venison from a deer he had taken during a late-season hunt, because Hattie had mentioned that Lydia was watching her money carefully, and the provision of real meat was a genuine kindness. She accepted each of these things with a straightforwardness that he appreciated. She didn't make them into more than they were, but she also didn't dismiss them. She said thank you the way people said it when they meant it, looking directly at him, and she put the book of poems on her windowsill where he could see it when he visited. He visited on Saturday afternoons, and now also on some Thursday evenings, riding the 7 miles to town after supper, and sitting with her on the schoolhouse steps or at Della's, or occasionally on the chairs that Hattie had put on the front porch of the general store for the purpose. They had been doing this for 6 weeks when the evening came that Monroe understood something had shifted between them in a way that was going to require him to say something about it. It was a Thursday in October, cool now with the first real edge of autumn in the air, and they were sitting on the schoolhouse steps with the stars overhead and the town settling into its nighttime quiet. Lydia had been telling him about one of her students, a girl of 12 named Bess whose family was planning to pull her from school to help her mother, who was expecting another child. Lydia's frustration was real, and her feeling for the child was clear in her voice, and Monroe had been listening and watching her face in the lamplight from the schoolhouse window, watching the way she moved her hands when she was exercised about something, and something happened in him that was completely beyond his management. He reached out and put his hand over hers where it rested on the step beside her, and she stopped talking, and they both looked down at his hand covering hers, and then she turned hers over beneath his and held it. The night was very quiet around them. "I need to tell you something," Monroe said, and his voice was quieter than usual. "All right," Lydia said. He did not look at her yet. He looked at their joined hands in the lamplight. "I have been spending time with you because I want to," he said. "Not because of Clara or the Locket or any sense of obligation or connection to something past. I want you to know that clearly, because I think you are a person who needs things to be clear." Lydia was very still beside him. "I don't know exactly what you feel," he continued, "and I don't need to know tonight, but I needed to say what I feel because keeping it to myself was beginning to feel dishonest, and I don't want to be dishonest with you." He looked at her then, finally, and found her looking back at him with an expression that was so open it was almost startling on a face he had come to associate with guardedness. "I have been telling myself very firmly," Lydia said, with the precise enunciation she used when she was trying to manage something that was trying to get past her management, "that this is a professional friendship, and that it is sensible and uncomplicated, and that there is no reason to feel about it any way other than gratefully. And," Monroe said, "and I am a better teacher than I am a liar," she said. "And I have known since approximately the 3rd Saturday that I was feeling something considerably more complicated than gratitude." Monroe looked at her for a long moment, and then he lifted the hand he was holding and pressed his lips to her knuckles, which was the most he trusted himself to do right now on these schoolhouse steps in a town where he was trying to be careful with her reputation as well as her heart. She let out a breath. "Monroe," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am frightened," she said very quietly. "I am not frightened of you, I am frightened of," she looked for it, "of how much this matters already. It has been 6 weeks, I have known you for 6 weeks. I know," he said. "I am frightened too." She looked at him with something that might have been surprise. "You don't seem frightened." "I have had more practice looking calm than I feel," he said. "Clara taught me that. When she died I fell apart very thoroughly in private and showed the world very little of it. I got good at that." Lydia reached up with her free hand and touched his face briefly, just her fingertips against his jaw, and Monroe felt it go straight through him. "I don't want you to do that with me," she said. Fall apart in private. I want to know what you actually feel." "What I feel right now," Monroe said, "is that I would very much like to court you properly, Lydia Keene, if you will permit it." She looked at him for a moment, and then that smile came, the real one, warm and slow and more open than any version of it he had seen yet. "I think I will permit that," she said. The courting, as Monroe conducted it, was a thing of considerable seriousness and small, steady gestures, because that was who he was, and she had made clear she wanted who he actually was rather than a performance of something else. He rode into town 3 times a week now instead of 2, and they took Sunday afternoon walks along the creek that ran a quarter-mile south of the main street when the weather permitted, and he attended the harvest dance at the church hall with her in November, where he discovered to his great pleasure that she could dance. She could dance the way she did most physical things, with competence and straightforwardness, and a kind of natural rhythm that suggested she enjoyed it genuinely. He was not the most graceful man in the room, but he was capable enough, and they moved together easily for 2 people who had not danced together before. And at one point she looked up at him in the middle of a reel with her hair coming slightly loose, and her eyes bright with laughter. And Monroe thought with a sudden and total certainty that he wanted to spend the rest of his life looking at this woman. They had their first real argument in November, which Monroe later thought was probably a good sign, because it meant they were both real with each other rather than performing. It started over a conversation about Bess, the 12-year-old student Lydia had been worried about. Lydia had gone to speak to the girl's father, a man named Garrett, about keeping Bess in school even with the new baby coming, and Garrett had been dismissive to the point of rudeness, and Lydia came to their Thursday evening meeting still bristling with it, and told Monroe what had been said. Monroe, trying to be helpful, suggested that perhaps Pete Grogan, who was friendly with Garrett and who respected Lydia's teaching, could have a word with the man on her behalf. Lydia looked at him with a very particular expression. "I don't need a man to argue my case for me," she said, with a quietness that was considerably more pointed than anger would have been. "I know that," Monroe said. "I meant it as an additional avenue, not a replacement for anything you're doing. The moment I allow a man to be my spokesman in matters of professional substance," Lydia said, "I become the woman who needs a man to speak for her. And then that is what I am, and every future conversation I have with Garrett and men like him is already lost before it starts." Monroe was quiet for a moment. "You're right," he said. "I am sorry. I was trying to help and I offered something that would have undermined you." She looked at him, her expression shifting. "You're not going to argue with me about this?" "No," he said. "You're right." She was quiet. "Then most men argue." "I try not to argue about things where the other person is clearly correct," Monroe said. "It seems like a waste of both our time." There was a long pause, and then Lydia laughed, sudden and genuine and full, and it was the most unguarded thing he had ever heard from her, and he loved it immediately. "You are very unusual," she said. "So I've been told," Monroe said. She won her argument with Garrett herself, as Monroe had known she would, by going back 3 times and approaching it from a different angle each time, until she found the one that worked, which turned out to be explaining in practical and economic terms that an educated daughter was worth more to a family's long-term stability than a daughter who could only keep house. Bess stayed in school. December arrived cold and busy, with the Christmas preparations in the town, and the school's end-of-year program that Lydia organized with an efficiency that impressed everyone who saw it. The children performed recitations and songs in the church hall, and every family in Harlan Creek who had a child in the school came out for it, and some who didn't. Monroe sat in the second row and watched Lydia manage 30 children on a makeshift stage with a calm authority that left him quietly astonished, because he had seen trail bosses with less composure handle considerably fewer people. Afterward, in the cold night outside the church hall, he found her in the crowd and she found him at the same moment, and she walked straight to him through the people between them as if she had intended to all along, and he met her halfway. "Did it go well?" she asked, which was a question that did not require the answer he gave. "It went beautifully," he said. "You went beautifully." She looked up at him, and the lantern light from the church hall doorway caught her face, and Monroe put his hand at the back of her waist, and she stepped closer to him in the cold air, and it felt so entirely natural that he almost could not believe they had only known each other since August. He kissed her that night. Not in the crowd, but after, when he walked her the short distance back to Hattie's store, and they stood on the boardwalk in the cold and the dark, and the town was quiet around them, and she looked up at him with that open, unguarded expression that she only had for him. He was slow about it. He put his hand to her face first and gave her every chance to step back, and she didn't. She leaned slightly toward him instead, and he kissed her, warm and careful and honest, and she kissed him back with the same quality she brought to everything, present and real and completely herself. When they separated, she kept her eyes closed for just a moment and then opened them and looked at him. "Monroe," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am not frightened anymore," she said. "Neither am I," he said. Winter in Harlan Creek was not the brutal thing that winter was in Kansas, where Lydia had grown up, but it had its own character, gray and dry with occasional ice and nights that dropped well below freezing. Monroe's work at the ranch continued through the winter months, the slower rhythms of maintenance and feed, and the endless vigilance that came with having a large herd in cold weather, and he found himself measuring out the weeks in Saturdays and Thursdays, in the times he got to be with Lydia. She wrote to her mother in St. Louis in January and told him afterward that she had mentioned him in the letter. He absorbed this with more feeling than he showed, because the fact that she had told her mother meant something about how she was thinking of this, and that meant a great deal to him. "What did you say about me?" he asked. "I said there was a cowboy I was rather fond of," Lydia said, with her eyes dancing in a way that he was beginning to treasure. "Rather fond of," he repeated. "Moderately very fond of," she amended, and he laughed. He wrote to his brother in Abilene that same month, the first real letter he had written in years, and he mentioned Lydia in it too, and said that he thought something important was happening. His brother wrote back within 2 weeks, which for a man who was not a natural correspondent was almost unprecedented, and said that it was about time, and when was Monroe going to bring her to meet people. He found himself thinking about the future in ways he had not thought about it in 8 years. Not vaguely, as something that would happen eventually, but specifically, with Lydia in it. He thought about what it would look like if she were not 7 miles away from him, but close, every day. He thought about what a life built together would look like between a woman who was dedicated to teaching and a man who worked cattle, and he thought that it was workable and more than workable, that it could be exactly what he wanted if she wanted it too. He waited until February to bring it up, not because he was uncertain, but because he wanted to be sure he was asking for the right reasons in the right way, which took time to get properly clear. He brought her out to the creek on a Sunday afternoon, which was their walking place, and the creek was running cold and clear under a winter sky that was pale and wide, and the cottonwoods along the bank were bare-limbed and gray against it. They had been walking for a while in the comfortable silence they had developed together, the kind of silence that only existed between people who did not feel the need to fill space with noise. Monroe stopped walking and turned to face her, and she stopped too, looking at him with those calm, perceptive eyes. "I need to say something to you," he said. "You have been working up to it for the last quarter mile," she said. "I noticed." "I know you noticed," he said. "I have stopped being surprised by what you notice." He took her hands, both of them, holding them in his. "I love you, Lydia. I want you to know that first as its own thing without it being attached to anything else I'm about to say." She looked at him steadily, and her expression was very open. "I love you, Monroe," she said. "I have for a while. I was waiting for the right moment to tell you, but I think the right moment is probably this one." He felt something ease in him that had been held carefully tense for a long time. "I want to marry you," he said. "I am not asking you right now, this moment, because I think you deserve the proper asking done properly and not on the side of a creek in February." But I want you to know that is where I am going, so that you can think about it and decide if it's something you want, and so that when I do ask it's not a surprise." Lydia looked at him for a long, quiet moment, the pale winter light on her face and her hands warm in his. "Monroe Cooper," she said at last, "I think that is possibly the most thoughtful way anyone has ever indicated a marriage proposal without actually making one." "I told you," he said. "I think before I act." "And what have you thought?" she asked. "That I want to be your husband," he said. "That I want to build something with you here in this place, or somewhere else if this isn't where you want to be. That you are the best person I have met in 30 years of meeting people, and that what I feel for you is the truest thing in me." She stepped close to him and put both arms around him and pressed her face against his shoulder, and he wrapped his arms around her and held her on the bank of that cold winter creek, and the world was very quiet. "I will want to keep teaching," she said into his shoulder. "I won't give that up." "I would not ask you to," he said. "I know," she said. "That is one of the reasons I love you." She lifted her face to look at him. "And to answer the question you haven't officially asked yet," she said, "yes." He kissed her there in the February cold beside the creek, and it was a longer and more earnest kiss than the one on the boardwalk in December. And when it ended, they were both smiling and she was slightly pink, and he thought he probably was too. He asked her properly the following Sunday, on the schoolhouse steps that had become their first real place, where he had first told her about the Locket, and she had first told him about Clara, and he went down on one knee on those wooden steps the way it was supposed to be done, and he produced from his coat pocket a small ring set with a blue stone that he had ridden to Fort Worth to find. The ring had been in the window of a jewelry shop near the rail depot, and the stone was a pale blue topaz that caught the light in a way that had made Monroe think immediately of Lydia, something clear and quiet, and with depth to it. He had spent more money on it than was entirely sensible for a ranch hand, and he did not regret this for even a fraction of a second. Lydia stood on the top schoolhouse step with her hand over her mouth, looking down at him with eyes that were bright, and she said yes twice, the first time barely above a whisper and the second time more firmly, as if she was confirming it to herself as well. He stood up and put the ring on her finger, and it fit as if it had been made for it, and she held her hand out and looked at it for a moment, and then looked at him, and he thought he had never in his life felt so entirely right about anything. They told people slowly and then all at once, the way these things worked in small towns. Hattie Bosworth embraced Lydia with tremendous energy and then looked at Monroe and said, "Good. Someone needs to take care of this girl and she won't do it herself." Monroe told the Calloway hands at supper that evening, and they responded with the particular combination of good-natured ribbing and genuine warmth that was characteristic of men who worked hard together and cared about each other without making a great deal of it. Judge Harlan shook Monroe's hand and said, "Congratulations. You've managed to make the best hire I've made in 20 years into something personal." Monroe accepted this in the spirit it was offered. Lydia wrote to her mother, a long letter this time, and her mother's response arrived 3 weeks later and was warmer than Lydia had expected, full of questions about Monroe and the town and what her plans were, and she sat at her small table above Hattie's store reading it and cried a little, which she told Monroe about that Thursday evening in the manner of someone reporting a weather event, without embarrassment but without drama. "She is glad for you," Monroe said. "She is," Lydia said. "She said she had hoped I would find someone who suited me and that she had begun to wonder, which is her version of saying she had been worried." She folded the letter. "I want her to come for the wedding. I don't know if she can manage the travel from St. Louis, but I want to ask." "Ask her," Monroe said. "We'll plan around whenever she can come." "That might delay things." "Lydia," Monroe said, "I have waited 8 years to want anything this much. A few more months does not concern me." She looked at him with that open warmth. "You are very good," she said. "I am trying," he said. Her mother, whose name was Ruth Keene, could not make the journey from St. Louis until May. They planned the wedding for the first Saturday in May, which gave them 3 months to wait, And Monroe spent those months with the same deliberate patience he brought to everything that mattered, working hard and visiting often, and thinking about the future with increasing pleasure. He also spent part of those 3 months thinking about Clara. He rode out to the far pasture one afternoon in March, alone, which he did sometimes when he needed to think without interruption, and he sat on his horse on top of a small rise and looked at the Texas landscape spreading out in every direction, brown and buff, and the first thin green of early spring beginning to show. And he thought about Clara Holt and said goodbye to her properly, in a way he realized he had never quite done. He had left Greer's mill rather than say goodbye. He had kept her tucked away in a place that was part shrine and part unhealed wound, and he had not examined it too closely for 8 years, because examining it had seemed like it would break something necessary. But he was not the same man who had fled a small Kansas town at 22, and Lydia Keene had, in the most unexpected way, done for him what time alone never entirely had, which was make it safe to be fully present in the world again. He sat on that rise in the March wind and let himself miss Clara completely and honestly, the way he had not allowed himself to do, and then he let it settle. Not away, just into its proper place. Something real and past and finished, alongside everything new and present that he was walking toward. He felt clearer after that than he had in years. Ruth Keene arrived on the stage in the last week of April, and Monroe met her at the stage stop with Lydia. She was a woman of perhaps 55, smaller than Lydia but with the same quality of directness in her face, and she looked at Monroe for a long, unhurried moment upon being introduced to him, and Monroe held that look steadily because he understood it and respected it. "Lydia says you are a good man," Ruth said. "I try to be," Monroe said. "I'm not certain I always succeed, but I try." Ruth Keene nodded, apparently satisfied. "A man who knows he can fail is more useful than one who thinks he can't," she said. Lydia, standing beside her, gave Monroe a look that said clearly, "Where do you think I get it from?" The wedding was held on the first Saturday in May in the Harlan Creek church, which the Reverend and his wife had decorated with wildflowers and early spring greenery, and the whole town came. Monroe stood at the front of the church in the best coat he owned, which he had bought new for the occasion, and watched Lydia come down the aisle on her mother's arm, because she had no father and had not wanted to ask another man to stand in for that, and she walked straight and steady and clear-eyed, and she was wearing her blue calico dress, the best one, and the locket at her throat, and Monroe felt the sight of it go through him with something that was no longer pain but gratitude, pure and specific. Because that locket had brought her to him. He had thought about the locket a great deal in the months leading to this day. He had thought about telling her the full weight of what it had meant to him, the way seeing it that first afternoon had felt like a message from something beyond the ordinary workings of chance. He had decided that some things were better understood between two people than spoken aloud to them, and that Lydia already understood it anyway, because she was exactly the kind of person who would understand something without needing to be told. The Reverend read the words, and Monroe said his, and Lydia said hers in her precise, warm voice, looking straight at him, and he put his grandmother's wedding band on her finger next to the blue topaz ring, and she put a plain gold band on his. And then it was done, and she was his wife, and he was her husband. And the church full of people made a joyful noise that Monroe felt in his chest like something splitting open into warmth. They had a supper at the church hall after, a long table of food that half the town had contributed to, and there was music from 2 fiddle players and a man with a guitar. And Monroe danced with his wife 3 times and watched her dance with other people in between, and thought that this was what happiness looked like when it was not abstract but specific and present. Ruth Keene sat beside him during one of these intervals and watched her daughter dance with Hattie Bosworth's husband, who was a terrible dancer, and Lydia was managing him with diplomatic grace. "She wrote me about the locket," Ruth Keene said. Monroe looked at her. "When she first wrote me about you," Ruth continued. "She told me how you met, about Clara." She was quiet for a moment. I was fond of Clara. She was a complicated girl, but fond of is not too strong a word. She paused. My sister was devastated when she died. We all were. And I am glad that the locket found someone who knew what it was and what it meant. She looked at Monroe. I am glad it led to you. Monroe was quiet for a moment. So am I, he said. Every day. They settled into married life with the same naturalness that had characterized everything between them, which was to say, they did not make it difficult when it didn't have to be. They took the small house on the edge of Harlan Creek that Monroe had been negotiating to rent since February, a two-room frame house with a kitchen and a bedroom and a back porch that looked east toward the hills that Monroe loved to watch in the early morning. It was not large, but it was solid, and Lydia made it into something warm and particular within the first 2 weeks, a thing she accomplished not by filling it with decoration, but by making every object in it intentional. Monroe continued at the Calloway Ranch, though he began talking to the foreman, a man named Bill Calloway who was old John Calloway's second son, about the possibility of a slightly adjusted schedule that would let him be home more evenings. Bill Calloway was fair-minded and had known Monroe long enough to value him, and they worked it out, trading some weekend time for more regular evening hours. Lydia continued teaching, which she had made clear was not a point for negotiation, and which Monroe had understood was not, and she threw herself into the second school year with the same passion as the first. She also began, quietly and without fuss, working on something she had been thinking about since before they were married, which was a petition to the school board for expanded school hours and a proper school library, which the children of Harlan Creek had never had. She drafted it at the kitchen table on evenings when Monroe was reading or working at whatever needed doing, and they talked about it together, and Monroe read the drafts and gave his honest opinion, which she sometimes agreed with and sometimes firmly did not. They argued about things. They always had, and it had always been the productive kind of argument between two people who were both interested in getting to the right answer rather than in winning, and it remained that way. He loved her in the mornings, when she was drinking her coffee at the kitchen table with her hair not yet properly done, and moving through the world with an unself-conscious directness that she shed some of in public because she was aware of how she was perceived. He loved her in the evenings when she read aloud to him, which was a habit they had fallen into accidentally and then kept because they both enjoyed it. He loved her when she was fierce about her students, and when she was frustrated with the limitations of what a woman in 1878 in a Texas town could actually do, which was a great deal but still short of what she deserved, and when she laughed at something he said that had not been entirely intended as funny. She loved him too, and showed it in her particular ways. She kept track of what he needed without making a project of it. She asked him questions about his work with the same genuine interest she had shown from the beginning, and she listened to the answers. She touched him easily, a hand on his arm or his face, in the way of someone to whom physical affection was not complicated. She told him the truth about things, which was the thing he valued most of all, because he had spent enough of his life in the company of people who said what was easiest, and the truth, even when it was inconvenient, was something he could work with. In the late fall of 1879, more than a year after Monroe had first walked into Della's eating house and stopped breathing at the sight of a gold locket, Lydia told him on a Sunday morning that she was expecting their first child. She told him over breakfast, directly and without preamble, because that was how she told things, and Monroe put down his coffee cup and looked at her across the table for a moment that felt very full. "Are you all right?" he asked, because that was the first thing. "Very," she said, "somewhat nauseous in the mornings but otherwise quite well." He stood up from the table and came around to her side and crouched down beside her chair so they were at eye level, which was something he did when something was important enough to want to be level with her for. He took her hands. "I am so glad," he said, and his voice was not quite steady, which was all right because they had agreed there would be no private falling apart. She looked at him and her eyes were bright. "So am I," she said, somewhat terrified but glad. "We will be terrified together," Monroe said. "Good," she said. "It will be more efficient that way." He laughed and she laughed, and they sat together in the kitchen of their small house with the autumn light coming through the east window. And Monroe thought that of all the things he had not expected when he rode into Della's eating house that August afternoon, the least expected and the most precious was this. They told Ruth Keene, who was still in Harlan Creek, having decided during her May visit that the town agreed with her and the proximity to her daughter agreed with her more. She had rented a small room from a widow woman on the north end of the street and had made herself useful in the way of practical, energetic women, and the news of the coming grandchild produced a response from her that was warm and pragmatic in equal measure. She immediately began planning what she could help with and what would need to be prepared, and when Lydia should think about reducing her schoolroom hours, which Lydia received with affection, and a firm statement that she intended to teach through the winter and they would reassess in the spring. The baby was born in June of 1880, a boy, arriving with the determination and noise of someone who had been looking forward to getting here. Monroe was in the room, which was not common practice and which the midwife, a sensible woman named Mrs. Adkins, accepted without much comment because Monroe simply did not leave, and Lydia did not ask him to. He held his wife's hand through the long hours, and he was there when his son arrived, red-faced and vigorous in the early morning. They named him James after Monroe's father. Monroe held him in the first minutes and felt something enormous and entirely new settle over him, this specific and particular love for this specific and particular person who had just come into the world, and he looked at Lydia where she lay exhausted and radiant in the bed, and his heart was too full for any sound he knew how to make. "James Cooper," Lydia said softly, looking at the bundle in Monroe's arms. "He looks like you." "He looks like a very annoyed potato," Monroe said, and Lydia laughed until she winced because laughing hurt, and Mrs. Adkins told them both to calm down. The first years of James's life were full and busy and good. Lydia returned to teaching in September with Mrs. Adkins's daughter, a quiet girl named Mary, coming in 3 afternoons a week to mind the baby so that Lydia could work, and the arrangement proved workable. Ruth Keene provided the rest of the childcare with a thoroughness that suggested she had been waiting for exactly this purpose. Monroe was promoted of sorts when Bill Calloway made him the head of the ranch's cattle management, which meant more responsibility and more pay, and crucially, more say in his own hours. It was the kind of advancement that came to men who had proved themselves over years, and Monroe wore it without ostentation but with the satisfaction of work genuinely valued. James grew. He was a sturdy, curious, opinionated child who was interested in everything and had his mother's directness and his father's deliberateness in unequal and alternating measures, and he made both of them laugh every day. In 1882, a daughter arrived, and they named her Clara. Monroe had thought about the name carefully and brought it to Lydia with the same honesty he brought to everything. He told her he would not use it if she had any reservation about it, that it was only a thought and that he wanted her honest response. Lydia had been quiet for a moment. She had touched the locket at her throat, the way she still did when she was thinking, the same habit Monroe had noticed in that first afternoon at Della's and had watched and loved ever since. "It is the right name," she said finally. "She was family. She was how we found each other. It feels like the most honest thing." "It does," Monroe agreed. The little girl they named Clara had her mother's auburn hair, and from very early, the particular quality of looking at things with complete and undistracted attention that Monroe recognized as Lydia's. She was quieter than James, observing and cataloging before she spoke, and Monroe thought sometimes that if she had Clara Holt's characteristic of keeping her inner rooms private, she had also inherited, through some strange grace of naming and circumstance, something of the woman she was named for. The thought made him glad rather than sad, which told him more about where he had arrived in his own healing than anything else could have. The years in Harlan Creek built themselves into something solid and particular. Monroe bought the house they had been renting in 1883 when the owner decided to leave Texas for California, and he negotiated the price with the same quiet effectiveness he brought to all practical matters. He added a back room in 1884 because James and Clara were sharing a space that was becoming insufficient, and because Monroe had the building skills he had accumulated over years of maintaining ranch structures, and the material was not hard to come by. Lydia's school grew. This was the achievement she was most proud of, and rightly, because it had not happened by accident but through sustained effort and advocacy over several years. The library she had petitioned for became a reality in 1881, funded partly by the school board and partly by a fundraising effort Lydia organized that drew from families as far as 20 miles away. By 1884, the school had 2 rooms, a second teacher named Agnes Whitmore, and a set of globes that Lydia had ordered from a publisher in New York. She wrote articles. This was something Monroe had not known she was doing until she showed him the first one, a piece about education in rural Texas settlements published in a teacher's journal in Austin. He read it with the full attention it deserved and then looked up at her with an expression that said several things at once. "You have been writing these," he said. "3 of them so far," she said, watching his face. "Lydia," he said, "these are excellent." She looked at him with that directness he loved. "You are not just saying that because you are my husband." "I am your husband," Monroe said, "which means you are going to have to decide whether to trust my judgment. I think you know me well enough by now to know I am not a man who says things are excellent when they are merely good." She took the paper back from him with a small smile. "The journal has asked for 2 more," she said. "Write them," Monroe said. "Write them all." She did. Over the next several years she became, quietly and without pursuing it, one of the more recognized voices in Texas on the matter of rural schooling and the education of girls in particular. And she was invited to speak at a teachers' conference in Austin in 1886, which she attended with Monroe beside her, because there was no reason not to and because he wanted to see it. He sat in the audience at that conference in a large hall in Austin and watched his wife stand at a podium and speak to 300 educators about what education in small communities required and what it could do. And she was absolutely clear and absolutely herself, and the room was with her completely. And Monroe sat in his chair in the audience with his hat on his knee and felt a pride and love so specific and located that it seemed to him to have weight, a real thing he could put his hands on. They came home from Austin on the stage, and Harlan Creek received them with the complete indifference of a small town to the remarkable things its residents did elsewhere, which Monroe found reassuring. James was 8 in 1888, and Clara 6, and Ruth Keene was still in her room at the widow woman's house at the north end of the street, more embedded in Harlan Creek than most people who had been born there. She walked James and Clara to school on the mornings when Lydia was already in early, and Monroe was at the ranch, and she had opinions about everything in the town that she shared with a freedom that her daughter had apparently learned from but applied with more editorial control. Monroe was, in the spring of 1888, 40 years old. He stood one morning in April on the back porch of the house he owned, before Lydia was up and before the children were awake, and looked east toward the hills in the early light, and the Texas morning was pink and gold, and the air smelled of cedar and the far cattle and the beginning of spring, and he held his coffee and he thought about the distance between 22 and 40. He thought about Greer's Mill and Clara Holt, and the long years of driving cattle and keeping himself separate from anything that mattered too much. He thought about an afternoon in August of 1878 in Della's eating house, and a woman with auburn hair and a gold locket and tired, careful eyes. He thought about 6 weeks of Saturdays and Thursday evenings, and schoolhouse steps and a creek in winter, and a blue topaz ring in a Fort Worth shop window. He thought about a son named James who was already better at numbers than Monroe had ever been, and a daughter named Clara who watched everything with her mother's clear gaze. He thought about his wife, who was sleeping in the room behind him and who would be up in 20 minutes, and would come to stand beside him on this porch with her own coffee, and would look at the same hills he was looking at, and would say something specific and true about them. He reached up and put his hand over his own chest for a moment, where the heart he had kept so carefully closed for so long was beating steadily and full. The door opened behind him and Lydia came out, wrapped in her wool shawl against the April morning cool, her hair loose and her coffee in hand. She came to stand beside him the way she always did, close, her shoulder against his arm. They looked at the hills together. "You're thinking something large," she said. "I do that sometimes," he said. "What is it this time?" He looked at her profile in the morning light and she looked back at him. "I was thinking about gratitude," he said. "The specific kind for specific things." She held his gaze for a moment, and then she reached up and touched the locket at her throat, the same small gesture she had been making for as long as he had known her, and he watched her do it as he had watched it 100 times and loved it every time. "Gratitude for what, specifically?" she asked. Monroe put his arm around her and she leaned into his side, and the morning light was spreading across the hills in long, warm lines. "For that locket," he said, "and for where it led." She was quiet for a moment. Then she reached up and unclasped the locket from her neck, which she had never done in his presence, and she held it out on its chain in the morning light, the small gold oval catching the sunrise. "Open it," she said. He had never opened it. He had not thought to, or perhaps had not felt it was his to open. He took it carefully from her fingers and worked the tiny clasp with his thumbnail, and the locket opened in his palm. Inside was a miniature portrait on one side, so small it was barely more than a suggestion, of a young woman with dark eyes. Clara Holt. Monroe recognized her even in the tiny image, the quality of her gaze, and felt the old familiar warmth and ache that was no longer sharp but was still there and probably always would be. On the other side was a small folded piece of paper, the kind so old it had turned pale at its folds. He looked at Lydia. "I found it when Aunt Pearl gave me the locket," Lydia said. "I didn't read it for a long time, and then I did, and I understood it was written by someone who loved her, and I kept it inside because it seemed wrong to take it out." Monroe unfolded the paper with great care because it was fragile. The handwriting on it was his own, younger and less steady, from a time before 8 years of ranch work had settled his hand. 3 lines. He read them. He folded the paper again and replaced it in the locket and closed it and held it in his closed fist for a moment. "What did it say?" Lydia asked softly. "I wrote it the day I gave her the locket," Monroe said. "It said that I hoped she would always know she was loved. That she was the best person I had met. That I wanted every day of the rest of my life to begin with her face." Lydia was very quiet. "She kept it," Monroe said, "all that time." "She kept everything that mattered," Lydia said. "That was Clara." Monroe opened his hand and looked at the locket in his palm. Then he looked at Lydia, his wife of 8 years, the woman who had walked into a town he was already in and changed the shape of his whole life by doing nothing more than sitting at a lunch counter with someone he had once loved's keepsake at her throat. He reached up and clasped the locket around Lydia's neck again, his fingers careful with the small clasp. "I still mean it," he said. "Every word, differently now for you now, but I still mean it." She looked at him with completely open eyes, no guardedness, no management, just her. "I know," she said. "I have always known." The children's voices started up inside the house, James's louder and Clara's more deliberate, the specific morning sounds of their family beginning its day. And Monroe and Lydia Keene Cooper stood on their back porch in the April morning and held each other while the Texas sun came fully up over the hills and the day made itself known around them. Later, James came out still in his nightshirt to ask if there was cornmeal for breakfast, and Clara followed him wrapped in a blanket. And Monroe picked Clara up, and she was warm and heavy with sleep, and she put her head on his shoulder. And Lydia was already back inside starting the stove, and the house had its morning smell of wood smoke and coffee. And Monroe stood on the back porch holding his daughter and looking at the hills and thought that this was everything. Not because it was perfect, or because nothing had been lost to get here. It was everything because it was real, because it had been earned by time and honesty and the particular willingness to be present in the world even when presence was difficult. And because the woman inside that house had walked into his life through a door made of grief and had turned it into something he had not known was still possible. James pulled at Monroe's sleeve about the cornmeal and Monroe went inside, and the day began properly, with 4 people at a table and butter and coffee and Clara, talking about something she had been reading and James talking over her about something he found more interesting, and Lydia refereeing with the easy authority of a woman who managed 30 children at a time and could certainly manage 2 of her own. And Monroe eating his breakfast and watching all of them and thinking the specific thought he had thought many times and never tired of. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. The years that followed were full and warm and built upon each other with the steadiness of things laid down carefully. James grew into a tall, serious young man with a genius for mathematics who would eventually go east to study, with his parents' blessing and his grandmother's particular pride. Clara grew into a person of quiet depth and sharp observation who would, in time, become a teacher herself, which surprised no one who had spent any time with her mother. Monroe and Lydia grew old in Harlan Creek, with the gradual, unspectacular grace of people who had built something real together. The town grew around them, more buildings on the main street, a proper rail connection in the early 1890s, new families coming in. They remained central to it not through any deliberate effort, but because people who do consistent, genuine work in a community tend to become part of its fabric without trying to. And every day of those years, the gold locket hung at Lydia's throat. Monroe saw it every morning and every evening, this small thing that had been his mother's, and then his, and then Clara Holt's, and then, by grief and time and the strange generosity of chance, Lydia's. He saw it and felt what he had come to understand about it, which was that it was not a monument to loss but a bridge, a small gold link in a chain of love that had not ended when any of the people in it ended but had continued on, finding new forms, carrying the warmth of each person who had worn it or given it or kept it forward into the next thing. He never wore it himself, and he never asked for it back. It was hers as completely as anything had ever been anyone's, and the knowing of its history was enough, was more than enough, was exactly as much as it should be. On the morning of their 20th wedding anniversary, Monroe woke early as he always did and lay in the gray pre-dawn quiet watching the light begin at the window, and Lydia was asleep beside him with the steadiness of someone at peace, and the locket on the bedside table where she placed it each night caught a first glint of the coming sunrise, and Monroe lay there in the warmth of his own life and was glad, in a way so deep, and settled it needed no examination, for every single thing that had led him here. Clara Holt had worn this locket, and she had been loved, and she had been lost, and she had not been forgotten. Her cousin had kept it and had carried it into a town and a lunch counter and an afternoon that changed everything, and Monroe Cooper, who had spent 8 years becoming someone who could be ready for this, had looked up at the right moment and seen it and said something, and the rest had been the truest and best work of his life. He reached across and tucked the blanket closer around his wife's shoulder, careful not to wake her, and then he lay back and watched the window go from gray to gold, and Harlan Creek woke up around them with the steady, unhurried noise of a real place where real lives were being lived, and everything was exactly as it should be.